Welcome to ABA on Tap, where our goal is to find the best recipe to brew the smoothest, coldest, and best tasting ABA around. I'm Dan Lowry with Mike Rubio, and join us on our journey as we look back into the ingredients to form the best concoction of ABA on tap. In this podcast, we will talk about the history of the ABA brew, how much to consume to achieve the optimum buzz while not getting too drunk, and the recommended pairings to bring to the table. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and always analyze responsibly.
Thank you, and welcome yet again to another episode of ABA on Tap. I am your co-host, Mike Rubio, along with Daniel Lowry. Dan?
How you doing, Mr. Mike?
You know, hanging in there. We're back to taking advantage of technology and recording remotely, if you will, and that's okay. I think that's allowed, and we've actually prided ourselves recently, professionally, in being able to offer that flexibility to clients, whether it's potential exposure or hot weather, heat wave, now that we're doing outdoor sessions a lot of the times. So yeah, this is good, man. Don't always praise the Zoom, and a lot of people like talking about how fatiguing it is these days, but in terms of convenience and flexibility, we'll offer it a little praise today, huh? So I'm excited, man.
If it weren't for Zoom, a lot of people, including us, would probably be out of work right now, so gotta appreciate that. But changing subject, man,
yes.
I am super stoked about the podcast topic today and differential reinforcement. Been looking forward to it, and we had a couple good podcasts on the criticisms of ABA and looking at them, but getting back in the comfort zone and looking forward to talking about some good old, meat and potatoes ABA and some ways we can improve or just some ABA strategies. So super excited for today, Mike.
Yeah, likewise. Let me just throw the theme out there, and then I'm going to let you give us a more thorough intro. I think that this is probably, for me, one of the more important frontiers in sort of in-home or lab to the living room ABA in terms of how it's been defined and how underused it is. But I really think that it lends the key to super dynamic, natural environment training style ABA. So we're going to be talking about the wonders of differential reinforcement. Dan, give us a little background, a little history, a little knowledge there.
Yeah, I think differential reinforcement is quite possibly the most important concept in ABA, because ABA is built on reinforcement. Like I always tell my staff, you can't have reinforcement without differential reinforcement, because you're always reinforcing something and putting something else on extinction. Otherwise, you're not reinforcing. So hugely important concept. Came about with talking with you about kind of how linear things get in ABA and how we can maybe make it a little more contextualized and a little less lab and more living room and more just naturalistic and social with differential reinforcement and putting things into ABCs, but maybe a little bit different than we might be comfortable or accustomed to. So look forward to talking about that. And yeah, I think that getting started, that a lot of times with our assessments, we ask parents skills that their kids do and skills that their kids don't do. And parents are really good at letting us know all of the things their kids can't do and the maladaptive behaviors they're emitting, because people are hardwired to look for these maladaptive behaviors. But I can't tell you how many times a parent's like, they just won't stop hitting themselves, or they just won't stop using this language. And I'm like, well, what do you want them to do? And the parents pause, and they have to think about it, because they don't even know what the appropriate replacement behavior is that they're trying to seek, which means they have no idea what they're trying to differentially reinforce. All they know that they're trying to stop something. And you can't stop something. You always have to replace it, right? It's like telling an alcoholic not to drink. Okay, well, that's not going to be too successful. So I'll pass it back to you, Mike, and we can go ahead and get started. But I think this concept of differential reinforcement is going to be exponentially important to any parents, practitioners. If you want to see more constructive behavior management and behaviors morphing with your kids and clients.
I couldn't agree more. Again, I think it's a really important frontier, and it's an area that, technologically speaking, is very complex, I find, in terms of data tracking, in terms of the way systems are conceptualized. Again, very linear in nature. Can't use that word enough in this sense. But at the same time, I have to admit that technologically speaking, I don't feel very fluent in differential reinforcement. And at the same time, from an applied perspective, I actually feel quite skilled at applying differential reinforcement. And I think a lot of that lies in the readiness to look at multiple three-part contingencies active at once. So one of the things that we discussed in preparation for this podcast were some of the obstacles that are naturally part of ABA, especially in current day practice, in the way we train a lot of our behavior technicians and the way a lot of our basic training in ABA, especially professionally speaking, comes about. We talk about discrete trials, we talk about three-part contingencies. And how many reinforcing consequences, in your experience, Dan, do those reinforcing contingencies usually involve? How many items? Are we looking at many possible ways to reinforce many different behaviors? Or are we looking at one SD, one response, one consequence?
No, man, it's one response, right, and then the iPad's coming. That's ABA.
And so only one reinforcer, right? That darn iPad. We love them, we hate them. But you get my point. So maybe let's spend some time on that. By design, yes, by practice, by the way we train, by the way we conceptualize this linear three-part contingency, that already leaves differential reinforcement out of the picture. There's already only one consequence that we're defining because we're taking this very lab-oriented, idyllic, three-part sequence that's obviously going to happen like that every time. And again, I'm not saying it's incorrect to conceptualize it that way. It's just not living room practice. So what do you think about that?
That was really enlightening when you brought that up to me, because we are so just hardwired into the ABC continuum, and what that is the ABC. So there's one A, there's one B, and there's one C. But there's so many behaviors, even when you're talking, right? If I'm in front of you, which I'm not, but I can still see you over Zoom, there's so many behaviors. You're vocalizing, but you're giving me facial expressions. You're giving me gestures. You're, doing all sorts of things at the same time. So for you to say, like, you're vocalizing a man, well, there's so much extra that goes into that. So many, I guess we could call them auxiliary behaviors, that to say, oh, there's this one behavior. Well, what if I say my man in a level 9 voice versus a level 2 voice? What if I say it with a cuss word before it or not? Like, there's all sorts of different behaviors that kind of break from the linear, I hold a phone in front of you, the kid says, I want phone, and I give him the phone. There's so many other behaviors in there that I think we need to start acknowledging and looking at the complexity of that, because then we can start to find things to differentially reinforce. Because if I'm giving the SD of holding a phone in front of you, and my case managers told me that I need to withhold that phone until you look at me in the eye and you say, I want phone, and that's all you can say, and then I can give you the phone, there's going to be plenty of times where we're just going to be both stuck in neutral because you're not doing it, and then I have to put you on extinction until you do the behavior I want. But there's so many other behaviors in there that could be differentially reinforced.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And we've discussed, and we actually, in all fairness, we'll just start admitting that we love beating the dead horse of blanket extinction. But it comes up as this great example of where we get stuck and dig our heels into this very procedurally sound, but not socially valid practice in terms of only one outcome being able to arrive at a desirable consequence, right? A change in experience as a result of your behavior that makes you go, oh, like just the simple idea that when we withhold items, the simple idea that it can come closer if you're getting closer, that you might be able to, and I get to practice this more easily with younger children, but just in doing the joint attention paradigms, which I love for for this reason, I think they involve a lot of natural differential reinforcement, is the idea is that if you naturally grab an item that's in my hand and I just squeeze it tight so you can't take it out of there, at some point that child's going to look at my face and be like, hey, aren't you going to let this go? And then I can let go that first time. Because now I've taught them to look at my face, which means the next time I can insist on a little bit more with a different item that's, now got more novel value or what have you. Those things that our best practices are usually very good at contriving. And I think, that's maybe for our later date, but I think that's where we've spent a lot of time in ABA measuring and documenting our data, maybe a lot of times toward best practices, things that we should just be doing no matter what, but we're checking these boxes because that's what we've been trained to do. And again, this will be for a later date, but are we really defining a lot of times the real socially significant behavior, or have we, taken exemplars for targets? And I think we've alluded to this topic before. We'll get into it at a later date, but I think it has relevance here with the idea of differential reinforcement. You alluded earlier, and I don't know if you want to bring this back, but even just the idea of replacement behaviors, functionally equivalent replacement behaviors, falls prey to this linearity of a three-part contingency. Replacement behavior or behaviors, that's a big difference in those two terms. And I think the singularity tends to be our habit.
Yeah. I do want to say one thing, and then I think the good segue into appropriate replacement behaviors is that think about like differential reinforcement in terms of just taking it out of the ABA context and just into the human interaction context, right? So let's say you and I are having a debate about, I don't know, whatever, politics, right? And I don't know, let's say you're a Biden supporter and I'm a Kanye supporter or whatever. It doesn't matter what it is. But if you're establishing your point and I disagree with your stance on something, I'm not just going to be like, nope, I disagree, you're on extinction. We got to find some common ground, right? I have to differentially reinforce some parts of your stance so we can establish a common ground, right? So like, hey man, I might not agree with your stance on taxes, but that abortion stance makes sense, or that stance on sexuality makes sense, or something like that. So just because you're not exhibiting the entire behavior or belief in this stance doesn't mean that I have to just put you on extinction. We can find areas to differentially reinforce. Once you find those areas of differential reinforcement within a conversation, you can then get on common ground. Now, it seems kind of one of the things with the divided society, and we won't get too much into that people aren't willing to differentially reinforce anything, and now they're just getting stuck in it's all or nothing. And I see a lot of that similarity with ABA, and that it's the entire behavior I want or nothing. I can't accept anything else. So that just came to my mind as we were talking. I think it's super relevant as people try to put it in the differential context, into the differential reinforcement, into the context of just everyday interaction and how we're constantly differentially reinforcing people through our conversations and all sorts of different interactions.
I heard somebody lend a great statement about conversation. You bring that in here, and I think the conversation is a great analog for this idea of differential reinforcement. When you're trying to make a connection with somebody, and that's what we're very good at in building rapport, conversation is really just a combination of mans and introverbals, right? That's really, if you break it down, that's all a conversation really is. And a lot of times, again, we're establishing this idea that we're going to have one set of those in linear fashion, and then we're going to get stuck on prompting that one over and over to get the one response that we're after, that we've called the target, when really it's just one exemplar of, say a larger vocal behavior semantic category or something like that. So it's interesting how pervasive this linearity is in everything we do. It just seems to really disallow us from looking at the greater range of consequences, the greater range of allowable behaviors that do occur because we dig our heels in one singular linear contingency most often. Now, even when we do apply DRI, DRO, DRA, or differential reinforcement of incompatible other or alternative behaviors, how many times in practice or in theory and reading do you see those being suggested in tandem or in conjunction. We're also using those in a singular application. So are you going to do a DRI? You're going to do a DRA? You're going to... The idea of this now moving away from conversation as an analog in this interchange of mans and introverbals where we might not necessarily get reinforced for that man we put out, or that introverbal doesn't get offered back to us as a speaker. It doesn't necessarily mean that we give up and then not put anything else out there. So instead of having a conversation, often what we're having is, I'm not even sure what you would call it, but I know we had a chuckle as we were preparing for this and, looking at your basic greeting paradigm, and it's like, hello, Dan. And then you don't say anything, so let me prompt you, Dan, now you say hello to me. I mean, how natural does that sound, and how differentially reinforcing is that by nature? It isn't. So how we sort of pursue this idea as more of a conversation that it's really our role to make the conversation happen. So we're going to have to put that man out there, and that hook and that engagement signal out there to try and get a response, and then we can reinforce that response. And then we're going to try to get another one and reinforce that response. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to prompt it and model or prompt it every time. So, I know I've said a lot there. I'll hand it over to you. I don't know if any of that made sense or inspired any.
Absolutely. I think it's, again, that constantly trying to get out of the lab. Like you said, very rarely, I mean, I've seen it in Cooper books, chain DRIs with DRAs and things like that, concurrent DRIs, DRAs. Those do exist.
Sure.
I think it's coming out of the lab and the internal validity necessary for a lab. So in order for me in the lab to say a DRA works, that's all I can do. I can't do other things because the more things I'm doing at the same time are going to add confounds, and now we've got new independent variables. So I'm losing the functional relationship between the DRA and the behavior change. So in the lab, that's necessary, right? In EAB or maybe even ABA, but in BSD, behavior service deliveries, we deliver it. We don't need to prove. It's the whole reason that we don't do with, really withdrawal designs, because we don't need to prove necessarily which one is working. We just need something to work. And if we can make it more natural, then the parent doesn't care if it's a DRA or DRI. As long as we can do a treatment package, probably consisting of all of them in some regard. I'm probably going to put somebody cussing at me, maybe on like a DRO-ish, and then do a DRA when they ask appropriately. A DRA for you can't cuss and not cuss at the same time. So a DRA and DRI is kind of the same thing in that point. Again, it gets kind of into lab semantics. So without getting, too much into that, my point being that let's not focus so much on which one we're doing because we're past the lab stage. Let's do them all. Let's get out of this linear. Let's get out of this we need to prove it and just get into what's going to work most likely in a living, functioning individual, because we're not dealing with pigeons and, lab rats.
Excellent points. I think you wrapped a lot of topics up nicely for us there. So let's try to move ahead.
Yeah.
You make a good point at the end there. It's kind of what we do, right? We tend to task analyze, and again, define these sort of singular examples of what we're looking for to reinforce. When maybe there's a lot more incidental learning, incidental behaviors, like in a conversation, that we're looking to grab onto and continue, make something happen again in that sense. So one example I like to look at is that of a tantruming 3-year-old. And let me describe this, and I'll try to do my best here and do it quickly. They tend to start crying uncontrollably. They also drop to the floor and, in a pretty obvious attention-seeking manner, bang their head on the floor. Occasionally. Of course, as a parent, one emission of that behavior is concerning enough. So let's kind of try to work together to dissect that or task analyze some of the incidentals that might happen, or some of the things that we might prescribe that might happen, towards really arriving at what would be Again, looking at my ideal British child, standing straight up and their hands behind their back and poised and looking straight in your eyes and speaking very properly with perfect etiquette, right? So we can get from the floor, crying, kicking, screaming, hitting my head, and seeing if you're paying attention to that point. But a lot of times in practice, as we've discussed before, we are often conceptualizing waiting for the reinforcement to occur until some much greater semblance of the desired behavior, like them standing fully or like them being completely quiet and standing and verbally communicating before we're offering, some reinforcement. Where would it be reasonable, for the sake of discussion, that you might offer reinforcement to the child for still being on the ground but not crying? And how often have we conceptualized things that way? And then further, what if they stand and they're trying to catch their breath and talk to you, but their tone still sounds inappropriate? How often do we see, professionally, well, no, that's not appropriate, your tone, or our girl saying appropriate tone? Have we missed a differential reinforcement opportunity there? I would say we have every time. So now the answer that we've been kicking around here is functionally equivalent. We're working toward functionally equivalent replacement behaviors, but we're saying that along the way, there are other scenarios that we might not offer 5 marshmallows for, but we're going to offer 1. Get a little taste of something good, because that part was right. But usually we're saying, nope, that part was cool, and that one was cool too, but you didn't get the right tone, and you're crying still, so no, you don't get any reinforcement. And we've lost a whole bunch of desired behavior or prerequisite behavior toward the goal and just left it without any attention.
Yep. 100%, man. It's so again, it goes back to the ABC. I think that the important question here is, what do you want your kid to do, and what are you willing to accept? That's the important thing. And I guess preface this, and we've come full circle, which is awesome. I can probably count on, almost one hand how many parents have had that answer ready. They'll know oftentimes what they want them to do. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. But, what they're willing to accept is all across the board. And that's got to be how we start this differential reinforcement with the appropriate. God, and we should almost never really use the word appropriate replacement behavior anymore. It should be appropriate replacement behaviors. It should always be pluralized, right? Because there's not just one behavior that we want to differentially reinforce. It's multiple behaviors, some semblance in the direction of that, that terminal behavior that we're trying to achieve. But there's a lot of behaviors within there. So many behaviors. So
I think you make an
really
excellent point in terms of the technologies there, and you certainly offered, I think, good insight there in terms of combining differential reinforcement procedures. I was making the point that in practice, maybe we don't necessarily see them happen together as much as we'd like. The best example that comes to mind right away is the idea of shaping. So the technology is there, right? Even just by description, the idea of shaping intimates all the various behaviors, like maybe you're still lying on the floor and kind of hitting your head or pretending to, and you're looking at me, but you're not crying. It intimates all those little scenarios along the way that you might lend a little love to. You might lend a little bit of that attention to, or whatever the function is. You might lend a little of that based on that behavior as you work toward it. But even in saying functionally equivalent replacement behavior, that shaping idea gets thrown out the window a little bit. So it not only do we have this focus on sort of a linearity, and the 3-part contingency, by nature, as we were saying, almost eliminates the idea of many consequences, let alone many behaviors that might receive certain consequences en route to or shaping a functionally equivalent replacement behavior. But then we also have this traditional focus on the aberrant behavior as what we need to focus and prove that we're reducing. Right? So that's sort of our self-fulfilling prophecy. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, let me ask you a question, Mike. If we are successful and we have these maladaptive behaviors, these behaviors for decrease. And let's say we're 100% successful. So we get all of the behaviors for decrease. Then what do we end up with?
Nothing.
We end up with a kid sitting there doing nothing. I'm not sure that would be considered a success in anyone's book.
Well, I mean, and it's funny because maybe, from a point of relativity, if your kid's punching holes in the wall, then yes. But we're saying, well, we can get it there. We can actually move in the other direction. We can then look at all the aspects of learning that are available. If we're able to reduce that undesired behavior, by definition, there had to be something we differentially reinforced, as we didn't reinforce any aspect of the undesired behavior. But again, it's not necessarily what's in our language or the way we conceptualize, because of the urgency, because parents need us there to reduce the obvious, so that the notion that we're going to come in here and maybe say, which would be very practical, hasn't everybody else, if we're here, hasn't everybody else already defined the aberrant behavior? What if we just place our focus on... Yeah, what if we just place our focus on the stuff that makes that go away, as opposed to continually focus on that stuff that allows us to be here? If that makes any sense.
100%, Mike. And I want to pass it back to you because you brought up a really interesting premise, actually, in the field that we work in, our day-to-day behavioral practice, especially with some of your early start under 3 clients, and that you've basically almost gotten rid of the behavior for decrease, just almost thrown it out, both from a quantifiable perspective and like a application perspective, that I think you think that by doing that, it leads the RBTs or the behavior technicians to focus on other things. So that was a great idea. It seemed to be pretty successful so far. So let me pass it back to you on why you've done that, because I think differential reinforcement is probably the answer.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Dan, and it is. It almost sounds heretical, right? That I actually have reports that don't have any behaviors for decrease, and I'll be the first one to say that it's not that there aren't undesired behaviors. It's just that I've begun to apply this notion that you already know that. So now early start and the younger kiddos kind of give me, and as they often do in our conversations, they give me a nice developmental premise and framework to start with, because I can expect certain things to be online and then there's already some delays. So it's easy for me to realize that a kid that hasn't started talking before the age of 3 might cry a lot. So I can explain that premise a little bit better in terms of its function or lack thereof, from a social perspective or a diversified social perspective. So it's a little bit easier for me to get away with this, and I want to say that. By no means am I saying that measuring undesired behavior or the challenging behavior it's obviously a huge part of our task in many situations. But allow me to sort of explain a little further, and maybe other parts will apply to people that are listening. Knowing that certain under 3-year-olds are going to cry quite a bit if there's been a language and socialization delay, I'm able to then shift the focus to the verbal behavior, to the joint attention pieces, to all those other things that are going to naturally build awareness, some level of self-soothing and self-regulation that comes from being aware of your environment and understanding what's happening next, and that, someone like us is there kind of offering you the world and all sorts of hopefully enjoyable, activity and experiences. I've been able to then shift our form and function, our application to, like you said, really just focusing on teaching those things, and then not occupying our technicians' hands with data or anything other than a simple behavior plan that we've discussed and that they have in their head, and that they've also already worked with the parent and they're working in tandem, and I've been there to work it a little bit. And these are the best practices that I alluded to earlier. this is our bread and butter. Why do we have to measure and write this out so much? I mean, again, I'm not saying documentation is not so important, but this is some of the linearity or a few of the foci that maybe take our focus away from more of the dynamic practice and the differential reinforcement aspects that we're trying to elucidate here and to shed more light on in that sense, exactly. So again, I've been able to get away with this, and it hasn't applied for every early start client or every early childhood client that I deal with, because on the other end, and this will be really interesting, I think in discussion, I'm not sure if we'll be able to explore it more now or later, then there are the other kiddos I'm discovering that once I'm able to help them self-regulate, if you will, to calm them down, to reduce their threat response, then a lot of the deficits that were examined and evaluated are no longer proving relevant outside of having missed a little practice because there was a child with such a high autonomic response. So in that sense, those kids only have a few behavior goals in terms of measuring reduction of this response or this behavior, because by and large, once we do that, I see that all the other areas are okay. For the most part, they just so verbally or from a communication perspective, we're still going to look at things like one-step instructions, because for a 2-year-old, that's just cool from a receptive communication aspect and from a compliance perspective, and making them more teachable. So we can still measure those things, but again, now I have just a few developmental goals in those domains, and then now a real true focus on the quantifiable pieces of the aberrant behavior, but not necessarily measuring a whole bunch of aspects other than the decreased duration and frequency, having worked out a pretty clear but simple behavior plan with everybody involved. So I love it. I know that, and I'm very grateful that you bring it up, because it's something that I'm very proud of professionally over the past couple years, that people like yourself have encouraged development of stuff like this and allowed me to try it out, and then further seen it for what it's worth. So I'll be the first to say that it doesn't apply across the board in terms of practice yet. I think that the concept and the construct, though, does. I think that it's good for us to start thinking about the idea that we already know there's undesired behavior there. Do we really have to count it? And how often do we have to count it? How big of a focus does it have to be in our data tracking and our efforts outside of the procedures to reduce it?
I think what I'm getting from you is that you're almost kind of looking at these behaviors as almost just like noise. And how do we filter through this noise to find the message that's being conveyed in there, right? It's like static, but you can hear some lyrics, and let's focus on the lyrics, not the static. Or I don't know, I asked my girlfriend to do something, and like, hey, do you want to go to this thing she doesn't want to go to? And she's like, well, I don't know, maybe, yeah, I'll go. And then I hear the yeah, I'll go. I don't care about the other stuff's just noise. And so that's kind of what we're talking about in this situation is, the yelling and the screaming and the protesting, that's all noise. Let's not focus on that. Let's focus on what's behind that and what could be reinforced within that. And stop spending so much time on the fact my girlfriend said she'll do something that I wanted to do. Does it matter that she didn't say, yes, I'd love to do that, honey? Like, it doesn't really matter, right? Like, why does it need to be back in this linear context, right? There's just so much noise. So let's not focus on that. Let's focus on the message behind it.
I like that. I like that concept of noise. Continue. I think I took your word.
Yeah.
There.
No, yeah. Go ahead, Mike, if there's anything you want to finish up on before you get to proactive and reactive. But yeah, I think that concept of noise, we need to, kind of drill
we want
in
the
with
signal.
our field.
Yeah, we're looking for a different signal, which is not that aberrant behavior signal. So that signal to noise ratio you're talking about, man, that's perfect. Like, it's like when you're trying to connect your TV, something behind your TV, but you need somebody to monitor the picture. And the way we're doing that right now is like we're trying, and then we're looking, and then we're asking, is it the picture there? And they're like, no, and then we're not trying anything else. We're really in that picture, or in that scenario, what you should be doing is wiggling that connection, trying to figure out like why is it not grabbing, continuing to apply some sort of solution to it. But instead, the way we're practicing is, okay, let me try to plug it in. Did it work? No. Okay, now let me reset my trial. Oh, let me try the same thing again. Oh, picture? Nope. Okay, let me try again. So it's and again, I'm not trying to make fun of our efforts because empirically, scientifically speaking, from a methods perspective, they're solid. They're spot on. Like we like to talk about in this brewing, analog and comparison of ours, there's a lot of things sort of coming together and filtering and ebbing and flowing to arrive at the right taste in your living room. So I think these are all really, really important constructs of this frontier of differential reinforcement, which I know even just a minimal exploration over the past couple of years from a real pragmatic perspective has done very well for us in practice. So we've had a good time today. Had a good brewing session. Sort of leads us to this idea that we're talking about reinforcement and we're still talking about consequence-based ABA. And there's nothing wrong with that, but if it's one thing we've made clear in our brewing sessions is that, man, there's three parts to this contingency. And why are we only turning the C knob when that A knob can use some adjustment and some changes too? Something we'd like to talk to parents about, and something that I'm going to say we don't have time to get into today, and that's okay. It's a whole other topic, but the idea of differential reinforcement, yes, then what else do we have to look at to apply in that recipe? Along with this now dynamic differential reinforcement that involves a lot of different C's that, or different B's that get different level of C that might be evoked by all sorts of different acceptable and diverse A's to promote generality. So we're talking about antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. What else, Dan, do you think might lie in this equation?
Yeah, that ABC, right? So it's like your TV example. You keep plugging the TV in the same way or trying to adjust the picture the same way, and you get the same consequence, and then you just get frustrated, right? The same antecedent and the same behavior leads to the same consequence, and eventually people are like, screw the TV. When maybe they could have just changed the antecedent and what they were doing or the knob that they were twisting. So
and then you hear,
what it comes down.
Well, I don't know, the kid doesn't want to do it anymore. They don't seem engaged. Really? You've been doing the same little contingency 50 million times, but they seem disengaged? Wow, that's surprising.
You give me a headbanging kid, and I can probably evoke a headbanging behavior. Like that's not rocket science.
That's pretty good.
Right?
I like that. Wait, so the behaviors that were listed in the report, I can come in here and make them happen easily because they were already happening? Wow.
And I can, you know what? I can mark it as a trial, and then it looks like it did something.
That's a minus.
So we can address it more in the next podcast, but the concept of differential reinforcement, for something to be reinforcement, it has to occur after a behavior, be contingent on a behavior, and increase the behavior. That after the behavior is a difficult context. So it's very difficult because differential reinforcement could be done proactively, but it's reinforcement, so it has to be done reactively. So the question is, behaviors are always occurring. So yes, it's done reactively to one behavior, but then proactively to a subsequent behavior in a behavior chain. So let's differentially reinforce some behavior before the likely, if we're talking about headbanging, the headbanging behavior occurs. What behaviors can we reinforce before we get to that headbanging behavior? Because, we can evoke that behavior. That's no problem. And then I can differentially reinforce after it. But now it's occurred. And now learning's not really going to be that on board until that behavior stops. And now we're back at blanket extinction, which, side note, I think I'm going to get a blanket extinction blanket. I'm going to make that.
That'd be awesome. You know what? That's an idea we'll have to talk about off the air.
But anyway, I digress back from my blanket extinction blanket. That we got to differentially reinforce proactively. And what I mean is before that undesired behavior occurs, we can call it non-contingent reinforcement. It's going to be contingent on basically the absence of the behavior that we don't want to have happen. Let's start looking for that. Let's make that a priority as opposed to looking for those instances of headbanging, which are probably going to occur because we know they occur. Let's find the behaviors that are happening in its place that we can reinforce.
So in that sense, sort of as a little final point, and leads us back to involving our dear friends and colleagues, the occupational therapists. When we talk about things like sensory diets, that should be applied before the head banging episode and not during. Is that what you're saying? So that shouldn't happen. You shouldn't get a massage as a result of banging your head, but you might get a massage in hopes that you might be relaxed enough to not bang your head. Is that kind of what we're...
Yes, and how much you want to bet that kid engaged in a lot of behaviors before they engaged in banging their head? Maybe like, hey, Mom, I don't want to do the homework. I'm not going to do the homework. Some vocalization, maybe not the best of a vocalization, or for a non-vocal client, maybe like, like some whining or fidgeting and stuff like that. Before it got to the head banging, they could have been reinforced, but didn't get reinforced, and then it went to the head banging. And now we're on consequence based.
Yep. All very, very important points. We've covered a lot of ground today in terms of differential reinforcement, looking at our three-part contingency, and by definition, not being very conducive to differential reinforcement, and how we train our young professionals in sort of discrete trial. All very important information, again, not very conducive to differential reinforcement. We covered the idea that replacement behaviors and the application of even differential reinforcement of incompatible other or alternative behaviors continues to suffer from this sort of linearity or this blanket application. What else did we cover, Dan? We
covered removing the maladaptive behavior focus to the adaptive behavior focus. We covered even doing differential reinforcement proactively, which sounds kind of like an oxymoron, but isn't necessarily.
I think lastly, looking at this as, and it wasn't the last point we discussed, but one other point, looking at this as analogous to a conversation. And as the professional, we're just looking for a way to start that conversation. We might say hello and not get a response. It doesn't mean we're going to keep going, hello, hello, hello. We got to differentiate our approach to arrive at some other differential emission of behavior that is alternative, incompatible enough from the targeted undesired behavior that now we're rolling in that direction. So I think all of these are very, very important things to consider as we are all out there helping the tradecraft and the field progress and evolve. Dan, always a pleasure, sir.
And we discussed, too, our first merch idea as it gets colder and those winter months come on.
Are we merchandising?
The Extinction Blanket is coming your way.
Extinction Blanket. Extinction Blanket, so you can keep it at home and wrap yourself in it at night and not apply it ever again.
Put yourself on extinction.
Just wrap yourself in your blanket extinction. Never use it again outside of your own home or own little space at a football game or wherever you would like to promote ABA on tap, which we're all for. So you guys are out there. Thank you for listening. We have some new listeners and some new likes on Facebook. Thank you for joining us. Please, 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 as all our social media outlets say, we're very responsive to messages. You can give us a call. You can text us. You can leave us a message on Facebook. You can email us. Please do reach out. Give us your feedback. What do you want to hear us talk about? What do you agree or disagree with? We want to hear from you. We want to keep this dynamic and a brew that everybody can not only stomach, but actually enjoy. So, hey, man, always good to see you. Cheers, brother.
Cheers, Mike.
Always analyze responsibly.
Cheers.
All the best.